The record of Michael King Jr. begins, officially, in Atlanta, Georgia, on January 15, 1929. He was born in a house on Auburn Avenue, in a neighborhood the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce would later call the richest Negro street in the world. His father was a Baptist minister. His grandfather before him was a Baptist minister. The church and the pulpit ran through this family like a geological vein, visible in every generation the census recorded. That is the version constructed from documents the 20th century kept. What the 20th century did not keep, what it had no institutional interest in preserving, is everything that came before the church registry, before the census taker, arrived with a column marked colored and another marked white, and no language for anything placed between the two. That is where the bloodline opens into territory the biography has always moved through quickly, and it is where the DNA, applied to African American families from Georgia's plantation counties over the last 2 decades of genetic research, has started to answer questions the official record never thought to ask. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The name itself carries evidence the biography rarely examines. Michael King was the name his father gave him, the name on his birth certificate in 1929. His father, the Reverend Michael King Sr., carried that name out of a sharecropping county in Middle Georgia, where the King family had worked land since at least the 1880s, when the census first reliably recorded them. In 1934, his father traveled to Germany and came back having changed both their names. Michael King Sr. became Martin Luther King Sr. Michael King Jr. became Martin Luther King Jr., the name honoring the German reformer placed over the one carried out of the Georgia fields. The German Protestant tradition and the Georgia Baptist one collapsed into a single family in a single act of renaming in the middle of the Great Depression, 2,000 miles from Wittenberg. What the renamed family did not discuss publicly, and what the genealogical record only partially preserves, is where the name King came from in the first place. In the plantation counties of Georgia, a surname was not an inheritance. It was an assignment. The people who emerged from bondage in 1865 took the names of the men who had owned them, or the names of the counties they worked, or names chosen from the air for the simple dignity of having one at last. The King surname in this bloodline leads back not to any royal line but to a Georgia county, a cotton operation, and the particular silence that descends over every American family whose origins the census was designed to record as property rather than person. The Georgia that produced this family was not a single place. The state that appears on the 1900 census as a fixed and legible geography was, in practice, a system of counties, each with its own cotton economy, its own church registry, and its own particular arrangements between the people who owned land and the people who worked it. The plantation counties running south from Atlanta through Macon and into the Black Belt were thoroughly documented for everything touching property and almost silent on everything touching the interior life of the people property described. The Williams family, which enters this bloodline through Alberta Christine Williams, the woman who became Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother, was rooted in Greene County, Georgia. Her father, Adam Daniel Williams, was born in 1863, 1 year before the war ended, the son of a man named Willis Williams. Willis Williams appears in the Freedmen's Bureau records for Middle Georgia, which means he entered the official record for the first time only after the legal category of enslaved person no longer applied to him. What those records do not contain, because the Bureau was not designed to record it, is where Willis Williams came from before the war, which African region his ancestors had been taken from, and whether any European ancestry had entered the family during the generations of bondage preceding the Bureau's jurisdiction. That information exists now only in the genome, and what the genome of African American families from Greene County and the surrounding plantation counties of Middle Georgia shows, when examined against the population studies conducted over the last decade of genetic research, is a specific and layered picture. The largest single African thread running through these families traces to the Niger-Congo region, to the populations of what is now Nigeria, Cameroon, and the coastal belt that supplied the transatlantic trade for more than 2 centuries. The Yoruba signal is present. The Igbo signal is present. What the mitochondrial DNA, passed mother to daughter without interruption, preserves in these families is a direct biological record of the women brought across the Atlantic, whose descendants populated the cotton counties of Georgia without ever being permitted to give their names to the census as a free person could. But the genome does not show only West Africa. In the study of African American DNA published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2015, which analyzed nearly 160,000 Americans who had tested with the commercial genetics company 23andMe, the average African American genome came back just over 73% African and just under 24% European. That European percentage is not a footnote. In the context of a Georgia plantation family whose documented history begins only at emancipation, 24% European ancestry is a measure of what the plantation produced and what the census was built to conceal. The European ancestry in African American families from this region does not distribute evenly across the genome. It concentrates in the paternal lines. The Y chromosome, passed father to son, carries the European signal at far higher rates than the mitochondrial DNA running through the maternal side. This asymmetry has a historical cause rather than a biological one. The men who owned the plantations left a genetic record in the children they fathered, but did not claim. The women who carried those children left a genealogical record in the Freedmen's Bureau rolls, and the church registries and the sharecropping contracts, and nowhere else. In the King family's paternal history, this pattern appears in a specific and documented way. The great-grandfather of Martin Luther King Jr. on his father's side was a man named James Albert King, born around 1864 in Georgia, in the final months before the war ended. Genealogical researchers who have traced this family back through Reconstruction-era county records have documented the likelihood, grounded in available census and county records, that James Albert King's father was a white man. The specific records are incomplete, as Georgia records from this era reliably are, particularly for families whose legal status had only just changed from property to person. The surname pattern, the physical descriptions in the accounts that survive, and the DNA evidence from the paternal haplogroups found in comparable African American families from this region all point toward a European contribution to the King bloodline that entered not through choice, but through the conditions the plantation imposed on the women living inside it. The Williams family side of this ancestry carries its own layers. Adam Daniel Williams, Martin Luther King Jr.'s maternal grandfather, built Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta into one of the most influential congregations in the city. He arrived from Greene County in the 1890s, part of a larger migration of African American families out of the rural plantation counties into the urban centers of the New South. What the census records as a change of address, the genome records as a continuation of ancestry that began far from Georgia. Population studies examining African American families from Greene County and the surrounding counties in the generation born between 1860 and 1880 find, with consistent regularity, the same genomic signature, a primary West African contribution in the maternal line and a measurable European contribution, ranging in most families from 15 to 28%, running through the paternal line. That range reflects the documented conditions of the plantation counties, where the patterns of unacknowledged paternity that the 2015 study found across the South were concentrated in their most systematic form. The families who carried this ancestry into the 20th century did not discuss it. They could not discuss it without consequence. So they moved to Atlanta and built churches and raised ministers and carried the genome forward, and the genome carried the history, and the census recorded none of it. What none of the census records, the church registries, the sharecropping contracts, or the Freedmen's Bureau rolls contain is the name of the African nation or the specific coastal region from which the original captive ancestors of these families were taken. The American record-keeping system had no interest in preserving it. The ships that carried enslaved people from the African coast to the Georgia ports recorded cargo weight and cargo value. They did not record the names of the people in the hold, or the villages those people had been taken from, or the languages they spoke before the Middle Passage stripped those languages from the record. What survived instead was the genome. The mitochondrial haplogroups carried in the direct maternal lines of African American families from Middle Georgia trace, in the studies that have examined them, to specific population clusters along the West African coast, primarily to the Yoruba and related Niger-Congo speaking groups in what is now southern Nigeria, and secondarily to populations from the Senegambian coast and the Central African interior. These are measurements. They represent the genetic signatures of specific West African populations that were overrepresented in the Atlantic trade because they were geographically accessible to the slave ports and because the demand for cotton cultivation in the Georgia plantation counties favored the agricultural populations closest to those ports. The women who were taken for specific economic reasons. The Genome records the reasons without commentary. The slave schedules of 1860, the last census records taken before emancipation, list human beings by age, sex, and the category the census form called color, which meant enslaved. They list no names. To trace a specific enslaved ancestor through the 1860 census, you must work backward from the Freedmen's Bureau records into the plantation records, from the plantation records into the estate inventories, and from the estate inventories into the tax records of the men who held the land. What you find there, in county after county across Middle Georgia, is a system that kept meticulous records of property and almost no records of the human beings the property designation covered. The gap between those two kinds of record is where the ancestry of families like the King family and the Williams family lives, and it is a gap the DNA is now capable of spanning in ways the census never was. The paternal haplogroup found in African American men from the plantation counties of Middle Georgia divides, in the population studies, into roughly two clusters. The dominant cluster is haplogroup E1b1a, the primary sub-Saharan African paternal marker present in the Yoruba, Igbo, and related West African populations at high frequency and carried into the Americas through the transatlantic trade. The secondary cluster is composed of haplogroups from the R1b and I families, the dominant Western European paternal markers, present in African American men from this region at frequencies ranging from 15 to 30%, depending on the specific county and the plantation history attached to it. The presence of European Y chromosomes in the paternal lines of African American men from Middle Georgia is not an anomaly the population studies regard as requiring special explanation. It is a documented feature of the genomic history of this region, produced by the same conditions the census was designed to render invisible. The census records for the King family, tracking them across the enumeration years of 1910, 1920, and 1930 in Georgia and then Atlanta, show a family classified consistently as colored across 3 decades of official record-keeping. The consistency of that classification tells you what you would expect: a family positioned fully within Atlanta's African American community, with no census enumerator considering an alternative designation. The one-drop rule did not need to be invoked explicitly in those columns. It operated as the background assumption beneath every box the enumerator filled in. What the census does not record is the European thread in the paternal line that the population genetics of comparable families from Middle Georgia confirms as a near-universal feature of bloodlines tracing back through the plantation counties of that region. The census recorded what it could see. The genome carries what the census could not. The Freedmen's Bureau records establishing the King family's presence in Middle Georgia in 1865 and after are among the more legible documents available for this genealogical period, but legible only at the level of name, location, and labor contract. They do not record ancestry. They do not record the haplogroup of the man signing the labor agreement or the county of origin of the woman listed as his wife. What they record is the transition from one legal status to another, in the handwriting of bureau agents operating under enormous time pressure. The names recorded in those documents are the names families chose or accepted at emancipation, which means they are, in many cases, the surnames of the white landowners who had held the previous generation in bondage. The name King in those records is the name a white landowning family used in that county. The census does not record whether the family took that name because it was the name of the man who had fathered some of their children, or because it was simply the name the bureau agent already associated with the people standing before him. The Y chromosome does not take a surname at emancipation. It carries the evidence of who actually fathered whom across whatever generations the plantation encompassed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The legal architecture that maintained these invisibilities in the 20th century was precise in ways the biology was not. Georgia was among the states that codified racial classification most explicitly in the post-Reconstruction decades. The one-drop rule, which held that any traceable African ancestry was sufficient to classify a person as colored, regardless of everything else the genome contained, was a legal standard with property implications, marriage implications, and during certain periods, criminal implications. For families that carried European ancestry in the paternal line and African ancestry in the maternal line, the practical response to this architecture was silence. You did not discuss the European thread running through the grandfather's Y chromosome. You did not point to the family member whose features resembled those of a white family in the next county. You did not explain to your children why the Freedmen's Bureau had recorded your grandfather under a surname that appeared in the plantation records of a white landowning family. You moved to Atlanta and joined the Baptist Church and built a congregation and raised a son who would eventually stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and tell a nation what he saw in a dream, and none of the official record-keeping apparatus of the 20th century thought it relevant to ask what the genome of the family standing behind him actually contained. The tools that would have made it possible to answer that question did not exist for most of the century. Genetic genealogy became available to ordinary families only in the early 2000s, when commercial DNA testing services began offering ancestry tracing at the continental and regional level. The academic studies that produced reliable population-level data for African American families did not appear in peer-reviewed journals until the second decade of this century, drawn from databases assembled through the participation of tens of thousands of families who consented to be tested. What those studies found was a picture of the American South the official genealogical record had spent a century obscuring. The genome of a Middle Georgia African American family from the Plantation era carried West African ancestry in the maternal line, European ancestry in the paternal line, and traces, in a smaller percentage of families from specific counties, of Native American ancestry from the Cherokee and Creek populations displaced from Middle Georgia in the 1830s. That Native American trace is faint, far fainter than family oral tradition in most of these communities claims it to be. The Cherokee or Creek great-grandmother story appears in African American family oral tradition from this region at the same frequency it serves in white Southern family oral tradition, and the DNA confirms it at the same rate, which is rarely and usually not at all. The specific question of what genome Martin Luther King Jr.'s family carried, beyond the documented Baptist lineage and the documented Georgia origin, is a question the available record can frame probabilistically rather than definitively. The King family's DNA has not been enrolled in the public population studies in the way that ordinary research participants' DNA would be. What exists instead is a convergence of evidence from the documentary record and from the population genetics. The census records establish the family's trajectory from Middle Georgia into Atlanta. The Freedmen's Bureau records establish the family's presence in that region at emancipation. The surname evidence places the name King in a genealogical relationship with white landowning families in Middle Georgia. The genealogical research on the King family's paternal line, including accounts that trace it back to a James Albert King whose father may have been a white man, represents the documentary argument that the genome of comparable families from the same region consistently supports. That convergence does not constitute proof in the forensic sense. It is a pattern, and in genealogical research, a pattern this consistent across a documentary record this specific and a genomic database this large is as close to the underlying truth as the surviving record will allow. The civil rights movement that Martin Luther King Jr. led was aimed, among its other targets, directly at the legal structure that produced the genealogical silences this bloodline carried. The one-drop rule that classified his family as colored, regardless of the European ancestry in the paternal line, was also the rule that made it illegal in Georgia to sit at a lunch counter designated for white use. Genealogical suppression and political suppression were the same system operating at different scales. What King said repeatedly, in the language of his sermons and his speeches, was that the color line was a legal construction rather than a biological fact. The genome proves that claim in a form that none of the legal or philosophical resources available to him in his lifetime could have provided. The 24% European ancestry in the average African American genome is a measurement of how thoroughly the color line failed at the thing it claimed to accomplish. The one-drop rule did not prevent the mixing it claimed to prohibit. It prevented the acknowledgement of mixing that had already happened. It turned biological reality into a legal fiction, and maintained that fiction for a century by making the acknowledgement of it illegal, socially catastrophic, or simply too costly to survive. The genome carried through that century what the law refused to record. The deathbed conversation, the moment when an elder finally said what the family had not said out loud for decades, is documented in African American genealogical oral tradition from this region with enough consistency that genealogists treat it as a source category rather than an anecdote. Henry Louis Gates Jr., whose documentary series African American Lives began examining the genealogy of prominent African American families in 2006, found this pattern across family after family. An elder, usually a woman in the last years of her life, disclosed an ancestry the family had carried in silence for generations. Sometimes it was a white great-grandfather on the paternal line. Sometimes it was a specific plantation, a specific county, a specific landowner whose name the family still carried as a surname without understanding why. The DNA confirmed what the elder had said. The haplogroups mapped to the ancestries the deathbed disclosure had named. The European Y chromosome in the paternal line of a family from a Georgia plantation county, carried in silence for generations, was what the genomic test found when the grandchildren finally had access to it. The 3% or the 7% or the 18% of unexpected ancestry that came back on a commercial DNA test for descendants of Georgia freedmen communities was not a testing anomaly. It was a measurement of what the plantation had produced and what the census had classified as something else. The genealogical literature on African American families from this region of Georgia, from the post-emancipation decades through the Great Migration era, consistently shows the same features that the population genetics have now confirmed at scale. The families who made it out of the plantation counties and into Atlanta did not leave their ancestry behind. They carried it forward into the churches they built and the neighborhoods they settled and the civil rights organizations they funded and staffed. What the genome of those families shows, when examined against the population studies now large enough to produce reliable county-level estimates, is a picture of the plantation's biological legacy that the official history of the civil rights movement has not had occasion to describe in these terms. The movement was waged by people whose genomes contained the history the movement was fighting to change the legal meaning of. The counties of Middle Georgia, where the King family's documented genealogical record begins, are the same counties where genealogical organizations working in this field have found the most pronounced concentrations of European paternal ancestry in African American families. Putnam County, Baldwin County, Greene County, Morgan County, the counties forming the core of the Middle Georgia plantation belt, are the counties where the slave schedules of 1860 record the highest ratios of enslaved people to free white residents, and they are the counties where DNA studies of their descendants have found the highest concentrations of European Y chromosome markers in the paternal lines of African American men. The counties where the plantation system operated at the greatest intensity were the counties where the conditions producing European admixture were most prevalent. The genome of the families who emerged from those counties in 1865 carried that evidence. It still carries it today, 160 years later, in the families descending from the freedmen and freedwomen who built the churches and civic institutions that eventually produced the minister born on Auburn Avenue. What the genome cannot do is restore the names the slave schedules erased. It cannot give back to the great-great-grandmother of Martin Luther King Jr. the name she was born with before she became a number in a cargo manifest. It cannot restore the language she spoke, or the kinship system her life was organized around, or the agricultural knowledge she carried across the Atlantic and applied in the fields of a Georgia plantation for the benefit of a man whose name the family would eventually take as their own. What the genome can do is confirm that she was there. The mitochondrial haplogroup in the direct maternal line of African American families from this region of Georgia, the haplogroup that passes from mother to daughter without recombination across every generation, is the biological signature of the women who made the Middle Passage. It is a measurement of their presence. A slave schedule entry gave them a number and an age. A plantation inventory listed them as a dollar value. The genome carries them forward into every generation that descended from them, unchanged and unerasable, carrying the biological evidence of a specific West African origin that the official record had neither the language nor the interest to preserve. The surname King passed from the plantation generation to the generation of freedmen, and then through 3 more generations into the Auburn Avenue household, where Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929. The German reformer's name was added in 1934, layered over the plantation surname, the way the Baptist tradition had been layered over the West African religious practices, the Middle Passage severed from the families making it across. The layering is the genealogical record of this bloodline. A West African origin carried in the mitochondrial DNA, a European paternal contribution produced by the plantation and refused acknowledgement by the census, a plantation surname taken at emancipation and carried forward without full understanding of its genealogical meaning. A German reformer's name added 2 generations later by a man who had traveled to Europe and returned wanting something in the family record that did not lead back to the cotton fields. Every name in this family's history is a layer over something older, something the official record could not contain. The genome is not a layer. It is what lies beneath all of them. The population studies that have now examined hundreds of thousands of African American genomes from the Deep South have made it possible to speak about these patterns with a precision not available to the Civil Rights generation, or to the Reconstruction generation, or to the Emancipation generation before them. What those studies show, for families from Martin Luther King Jr.'s region and genealogical background, is a consistent picture. West African ancestry in the mitochondrial line, European ancestry in the paternal Y chromosome line at rates reflecting the plantation history of the specific county, and a documentary record containing none of it because the documentary record was designed for other purposes. The genome is the record the plantation system produced but could not file. It was filed instead in the chromosomes of the families who survived the plantation, who walked out of it in 1865 and built churches and moved to Atlanta and raised children and raised grandchildren, and who are still here, carrying a genomic history the census taker on Auburn Avenue in 1930 had no box for. What remains, and what the DNA testing now available to any family is capable of surfacing, is the specific shape of that history in individual bloodlines. A 3% European contribution to an otherwise West African genome is one shape. A 22% European contribution concentrated in the paternal line of a family from a high-intensity plantation county is another. A mitochondrial haplogroup placing the direct maternal line in the Yoruba-speaking region of what is now Nigeria is a third. None of these findings erases the African-American identity of the families carrying them. They add to the biography of a family the genealogical substance the census stripped from it when it reduced a human being to a color category and a labor value. The family from Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, the one the census recorded in 1930 as a colored household, the one that raised a minister who would eventually force the legal system of the country to dismantle the very classification apparatus that had produced these genealogical silences, that family held a genome the census form had no language for. The genome is still there, it is still legible, and it is still carrying the record of everything the census was designed to forget. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.